In an age where money seems to govern our lives, where markets fluctuate with each breaking news story, and where economic theories shape the policies of nations, we often forget that economic thought wasn't always about supply and demand curves or GDP growth. Long before Adam Smith penned The Wealth of Nations in 1776, brilliant minds across civilizations were pondering fundamental questions about wealth, value, and how resources should be allocated. But their approach was radically different from our modern understanding. Imagine a world where economics wasn't separated from ethics, where the pursuit of wealth was viewed with suspicion rather than celebration, and where the ideal economy was one that supported virtue rather than maximizing profit. This wasn't some utopian fantasy, this was how the ancient world's greatest thinkers approached questions of economics. Today, we'll journey across time and space to explore the economic wisdom of the ancients, from the olive groves of Athens to the imperial courts of India and China. The story begins in ancient Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, a golden age of philosophy when thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were revolutionizing how humans understood the world. It was in this intellectual ferment that the very word economics was born. The term comes from the Greek oikonomia, a combination of oikos, meaning household, and nomos, meaning management or law. For the Greeks, economics wasn't primarily about markets or trade, it was about managing the household well. One of the earliest systematic thinkers on economics was Xenophon, a student of Socrates who lived from around 430 to 354 BCE. A man of many talents, soldier, historian, and philosopher, Xenophon wrote a work called Economicus, often translated as The Economist or On Household Management. In this dialogue, Socrates discusses with a wealthy Athenian named Ischomachus the proper ways to manage an estate. Xenophon's work reveals a conception of economics focused on agricultural productivity, proper household administration, and the virtues needed to maintain prosperity. He writes, "Agriculture is an art that raises up all other arts. When agriculture flourishes, all other arts flourish, but when the ground is forced to lie barren, the other arts almost cease by land and sea." For Xenophon, farming wasn't just one occupation among many, it was the fundamental economic activity that supported all others. This perspective reveals something crucial about ancient economic thought: its emphasis on production rather than exchange. While modern economics often focuses on markets where goods are bought and sold, ancient thinkers were more concerned with how goods were produced in the first place. And they saw agriculture as the most natural and virtuous form of production. Even more influential than Xenophon was his contemporary Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BCE. Aristotle's economic thinking appears in his works Politics and Nicomachean Ethics, where he draws a crucial distinction that would shape economic thought for centuries to come. Aristotle distinguished between what he called oikonomike, household management aimed at providing for the needs of the household, and krematistike, the art of acquiring wealth and property. This distinction might seem subtle, but it gets at something profound: the difference between acquiring what is needed for a good life and the endless pursuit of money for its own sake. In a passage that still resonates today, Aristotle writes, "The life of money-making is one undertaken under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else." For Aristotle, economic activity should serve the higher purpose of enabling a virtuous life, not become an end in itself. This brings us to one of Aristotle's most famous economic contributions, his critique of usury, or lending money at interest. To modern ears, Aristotle's objection to interest might sound strange. After all, our entire financial system is built on the lending of money at interest. But Aristotle's reasoning reveals much about the ancient mindset. He argued that money is sterile. It doesn't naturally reproduce or grow. When a farmer plants grain, nature causes it to multiply into a harvest. But when someone hoards coins, they remain exactly the same. Therefore, Aristotle reasoned, charging interest was unnatural because it treated money as if it could reproduce itself. As he put it, the most hated sort of wealth-getting, and with the greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of it. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest. Here we see a fundamental difference between ancient and modern economic thinking. For us, money is a store of value that naturally grows over time through investment. For Aristotle, money was primarily a medium of exchange, and using it to generate more money was a perversion of its purpose. Aristotle's ideas on economic justice extended beyond his critique of usury. He developed a sophisticated theory of exchange based on what he called proportionate reciprocity. For exchange to be just, he argued, goods must be equalized according to need. This required a single measure, money, that could make different goods commensurable. But, unlike modern economists who often treat market prices as natural outcomes of supply and demand, Aristotle viewed just exchange as a moral matter. Trade should aim at fairness and meeting needs, not maximizing profit. In fact, Aristotle was deeply suspicious of retail trade, buying goods to sell them at a higher price. He considered this less natural than producing goods directly or trading surplus for necessities. In Aristotle's ideal polis, or city-state, citizens would focus on politics, philosophy, and military service rather than commerce. Economic activities were necessary but relegated to non-citizens like resident foreigners or slaves. This reflects another aspect of ancient economic thought. Economic roles were deeply intertwined with social and political status. While Xenophon and Aristotle were developing these ideas in Greece, equally sophisticated economic thinking was emerging thousands of miles away in ancient China. There, during what historians call the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period, 771 to 221 BCE, Confucius and his followers were articulating economic views that would influence Chinese civilization for millennia. Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BCE, didn't leave written works himself, but his teachings were recorded by disciples in texts like the Analects. Like his Greek counterparts, Confucius saw economics as inseparable from ethics and politics. The proper ordering of the household was part of the proper ordering of the state, which in turn reflected the natural order of the cosmos. In the Analects, Confucius states, "The superior man thinks of virtue, the small man thinks of comfort. The superior man understands what is right, the small man understands what will sell." This contrast reveals the Confucian suspicion of commerce and profit-seeking, which parallels Aristotle's views despite developing independently. For Confucians, society was ideally ordered into 4 occupational classes: scholars, including government officials, farmers, artisans, and merchants, with merchants ranked lowest despite often being wealthiest. This hierarchy wasn't based on wealth or power but on how each occupation contributed to society. Scholars provided moral and intellectual guidance. Farmers produced essential food. Artisans created necessary goods. Merchants merely moved goods around while seeking profit. The Confucian classics repeatedly praise agriculture as the foundation of the economy. In the Book of Mencius, a key Confucian text from the 4th century BCE, we read that a ruler should not levy duties at borders and in markets and should not impose restrictions on farming. These policies would ensure agricultural prosperity, which Confucians saw as the basis for social stability. Like Aristotle, Confucian thinkers were suspicious of profit-seeking. The concept of wai yue, righteousness, was often contrasted with li, profit or benefit. In the Analects, Confucius says, "The superior man understands righteousness. The small man understands profit." This doesn't mean profit was forbidden. Rather, it should be subordinated to moral considerations and the common good. Moving from China to the Indian subcontinent, we encounter perhaps the most pragmatic and detailed economic thinking of the ancient world in the work of Kautilya, also known as Chanakya. Kautilya served as the chief advisor to Chandragupta Maurya, who founded the Mauryan Empire around 321 BCE, the first empire to unite most of the Indian subcontinent. Kautilya's masterwork, the Arthashastra, or Science of Political Economy, is remarkable for its scope and detail. Unlike the more philosophical approaches of Greek and Chinese thinkers, the Arthashastra is a practical handbook for rulers, covering everything from taxation and agriculture to espionage and warfare. The very title of Kautilya's work reveals its approach. Artha means wealth or material well-being, and Shastra means science or knowledge. For Kautilya, economic prosperity was an essential pillar of statecraft, alongside dharma, righteousness, and kama, pleasure. As he writes, "From the strength of the treasury the army is born. From the treasury comes the power to undertake works beneficial to the people." Kautilya recognized that a strong economy required active state involvement. He advocated for the king to build irrigation works, establish mines, clear forests for agriculture, and create settlements in undeveloped regions. In Kautilya's view, in the happiness of his subjects lies the king's happiness, in their welfare, his welfare. The Arthashastra outlines detailed regulations for markets, including provisions against fraud, adulteration of goods, and price manipulation. It prescribes standard weights and measures and establishes fines for those who cheat customers. Kautilya even recommends that the state operate certain industries directly, particularly those strategic to national security. On taxation, Kautilya offers sophisticated advice that balances the king's need for revenue with the welfare of subjects. As the bee collects honey from flowers gradually without harming them, so should the king collect annual taxes from his subjects. He recommends tax rates typically around 1/6 of agricultural produce, enough to fund state activities but not so much as to discourage production. Unlike Aristotle and Confucius, Kautilya takes a more pragmatic view of money lending and interest. He recognizes their economic necessity while establishing regulations to prevent exploitation. The Arthashastra prescribes maximum interest rates that vary depending on the purpose and risk of the loan. 15% for commercial ventures, 60% for highly risky ventures like wilderness trading expeditions or sea voyages. Despite these differences, Kautilya shares with other ancient thinkers a view of economics as embedded within a moral framework. The ultimate goal of economic policy wasn't wealth for its own sake, but yogakshema, the material well-being and security of the people, which would enable them to practice dharma, virtue. Looking across these traditions, Greek, Chinese, and Indian, several common themes emerge in ancient economic thought. First, economics wasn't seen as an autonomous discipline, but as part of ethics, politics, and household management. Economic questions were fundamentally moral questions about how resources should be used to support a good life. Second, ancient thinkers emphasized production over exchange, with special reverence for agriculture as the most natural and essential economic activity. Trade and commerce were viewed as necessary but morally suspect, especially when pursued solely for profit. Third, self-sufficiency was highly valued, whether at the household level, as in Greece, or the national level, as in China and India. Dependence on foreign trade was seen as a potential vulnerability. Fourth, ancient economic thought distinguished between natural limits to wealth, meeting genuine needs, and unlimited desire for money. The former was approved, the latter condemned as unnatural and corrupting. Finally, ancient thinkers understood economics as embedded in social relationships and natural hierarchies. Economic roles weren't just ways of making a living, but expressions of one's place in the cosmic order. These ancient perspectives challenge us to rethink our modern assumptions about economics. Today, we often speak of the economy as if it were an autonomous system with its own laws, separate from our moral and political choices. We measure economic success primarily through growth metrics like GDP, rather than asking whether economic arrangements support virtue and well-being. The ancients remind us that economies don't exist in a vacuum. They're human creations that reflect our values and priorities. When Aristotle distinguishes between household management and money-making, when Confucius ranks occupations by their contribution rather than their profit, when Kautilya advises kings to collect taxes like bees collect honey, they're all suggesting that economic choices should serve human flourishing in its fullest sense. This doesn't mean we should romanticize ancient economies, which included slavery, extreme inequality, and frequent scarcity. But the philosophical frameworks these thinkers developed offer valuable perspectives for our own time. As we face growing inequality, environmental degradation, and questions about the purpose of our economic system, the ancients invite us to ask, what is wealth for? How much is enough? What economic arrangements best support human virtue and community? These questions were central to economic thought for centuries before the modern era and remain essential today. In our market-dominated world, it's easy to forget that economic thinking wasn't always centered on markets. The ancients saw economics primarily as household management, state administration, and moral philosophy. Their insights remind us that while markets are powerful tools, they aren't ends in themselves. They're means to enable human flourishing. And in a time when economic discourse often seems divorced from considerations of the good life, that's a lesson worth remembering.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.